Tony Bennett had one of the great American careers in entertainment. Today, we'll take a look back at the iconic singer's career. Hi there, everyone. I'm Jeff, and this is Plain English, where we help you upgrade your English with stories about current events and trending topics. This is lesson 597, so you can find the full lesson online at plainenglish.com/597. Coming up today, when someone has a second act, they find success for a second time in their career, usually after suffering through a slump. Steve Jobs is a great example. He co-founded Apple Computer in 1976. He was fired from the company he founded in 1985. After 11 years, though, Apple hired him back and he led the company and the world into the smartphone era with the iPhone. That was his second act. Well, Tony Bennett had a second act, and it was one of the great second acts in all of entertainment. Tony Bennett died on July 21st this year, just a few days shy of his 97th birthday. We'll talk about Tony Bennett's remarkable career today, and we'll continue it on Monday. You know, I like to say you're learning English, so you should know about the English-speaking world. Tony Bennett was a giant in American music culture, and he is well worth learning about. In the second half of today's audio lesson, we'll talk about the English expression give way, and we have a song of the week from Tony Bennett himself. The Great American Songbook is a genre of music that was written for the stage, musical theater, and Hollywood in the early 20th century, roughly from the 1920s to the 1960s. These are classic jazz standards and show tunes that stood the test of time. They were popular in a variety of settings and for a long time. The name is a little deceptive since there isn't a book, but the genre includes songs written by Irving Berlin, George Gershwin, Cole Porter, and others. This was the music that Tony Bennett sang over his remarkable 7-decade singing career. They're songs like The Way You Look Tonight, Rags to Riches, and The Best Is Yet to Come. You might not recognize those songs today, but I guarantee that some of your favorite English-speaking singers do recognize them. Tony Bennett started singing these classics as an opening act for other musicians. Then he became a star in his own right. He suffered a slump during the advent of rock and roll, and then he pulled off a stunning second act that saw him perform with contemporary artists as varied as Elton John and Amy Winehouse. He was born Antonio Dominick Benedetto in Astoria, a working-class neighborhood of Queens in New York City. His father came to America from Italy as a 7-year-old. His mother was born in the States, having crossed the Atlantic in the womb. As a child, Anthony found an early interest in singing and painting. At just 10 years old, he sang at the inauguration of the Tri-Borough Bridge in New York City, a massive bridge that connects 3 of the city's 5 boroughs. Then Mayor Fiorella LaGuardia patted him on the head. As a young man, Benedetto was drafted to serve in World War II. He was shipped off to fight in Europe right as the war was reaching its end. He later described the experience as a front row seat in hell. While in service there, he was among the first soldiers to discover and liberate the concentration camps. Upon returning to the States, he took advantage of the GI Bill, government support for soldiers to go to college. He studied music and theater. He began singing in nightclubs. His big break came in 1949. He was the opening act for another singer, Pearl Bailey. In the audience that night was Bob Hope, a larger-than-life comedian and celebrity. Bob Hope liked what he heard from Benedetto, and he said he wanted the two to perform together in the future. Just one problem. Antonio Dominick Benedetto wasn't the name of a performer, at least not an American one. And so he told Anthony that he would, from that moment on, be known as Tony Bennett. That was good advice from Leslie Towns Hope, a superstar who had shortened his own name years earlier. Tony Bennett started performing with Bob Hope, but soon Bennett himself became the star attraction. Police had to put up barricades to hold back the crowds of people trying to get into his concerts. He started recording his own music. His first hit was Boulevard of Broken Dreams, released in 1950. He followed that up with other hits like Cold, Cold Heart and Rags to Riches. He played on the first ever episode of The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson in 1962. Tony Bennett became the hottest ticket in New York, Los Angeles, and Las Vegas. In the early 1960s, he was riding high. His pianist brought him a song he thought Bennett would like. It was called I Left My Heart in San Francisco. Bennett performed it for the first time in, where else? San Francisco. He then recorded it and released it on a B-side. That was the opposite side of a vinyl record, the side where you just put an extra song that you didn't think would be very popular. But it turned out to be his biggest ever hit. He won 2 Grammys for I Left My Heart in San Francisco. Riding the strength of San Francisco, he was invited to perform at Carnegie Hall in New York City. It's New York City's most famous music venue. The show was a smashing success, receiving almost unanimous critical acclaim. But in the late 1960s, as the early classics gave way to rock and roll, Tony Bennett's career slumped. The Beatles played the Hollywood Bowl in front of thousands of delirious, screaming fans. The Rolling Stones exuded a bad boy sexuality. Tony Bennett songs like Cheek to Cheek, which romanticized a polite, slow dancing, well, those seemed less and less relevant. Little did anyone know at the time, though, that this singer of the classics wasn't even halfway through his career. He still had his second act in front of him. And this is where we'll pause our story for today. We'll resume it on Monday when we'll talk about Tony Bennett's second act. Just to give you an idea of the range and influence Tony Bennett had in his career, and you'll hear more about this on Monday, but he worked with and performed with musical artists of every type. Miles Davis, Count Basie, Natalie Cole, Elvis Costello, and Aretha Franklin from the jazz era. From folk and country, James Taylor, Willie Nelson. From rock and roll, Paul McCartney, Elton John, Billy Joel, Bono, Sting. Classic singers like Barbra Streisand and Celine Dion. From country, Tim McGraw, the Dixie Chicks, Carrie Underwood. From more modern pop music, Mariah Carey, K.D. Lang, Diana Krall, Lady Gaga, the list goes on. So that's why I say you may never have heard the name Tony Bennett or heard any one of the songs he sang, but I guarantee a lot of your favorite English-speaking singers absolutely heard them and may have even performed with Tony Bennett. JR has given me permission to select the song of the week this week, and I am going to select my favorite song from Tony Bennett's catalog. It's The Way You Look Tonight. Now, this is a perfect example of a Tony Bennett song. He didn't write it. He didn't write his songs. The song was written in 1936 for a movie called Swing Time. The famous early actor Fred Astaire performed it in the movie. Like many songs from that time, the song doesn't seem to belong to any one artist. Bing Crosby sang the song, Frank Sinatra did, Michael Bublé did. Tony Bennett first recorded The Way You Look Tonight in 1958, and he released another in 1997 for the movie My Best Friend's Wedding. And he released a duet with Faith Hill in 2011. And that's the version we'll pick as the song of the week. We'll put a link to it in the lesson email and in our Instagram stories. The Way You Look Tonight, the duet between Tony Bennett and Faith Hill, is the song of the week. All right, enough music for now. Let's pivot to an English expression. Today, it's give way. All right, let's talk about what it means to give way. This is a phrasal verb. It has multiple meanings, but today we'll talk about just one meaning, which is to describe a change in the way things happen or the way things are. When we use it in this sense, we mean that one system or one way of doing things replaces another. The old system gives way to the new system. The old way of doing things gives way to the new way of doing things. Today, I said that in the 1960s, the age of the Great American Songbook gave way to rock and roll music. That means rock and roll became the new way of doing things. Rock and roll replaced the older jazz club songs. Singers like Frank Sinatra and Tony Bennett, they were the big stars in the 1940s, 1950s, and early 1960s. But then, the British invasion. The British invasion was a time in the mid-60s when British bands suddenly became popular in America. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Dave Clark Five, Herman's Hermits, and more, they all started in Britain and became very popular in the US. And this wasn't a fad. It became clear that the most popular styles were not going to be The Way You Look Tonight, but songs like Start Me Up by the Rolling Stones, a totally different vibe. So I said today, the Great American Songbook gave way to rock and roll. It gave up its dominant position and something else took its place. One system replaced another. The old jazz and musical songs gave way to rock and roll. Globalization. Do you remember that term? This term described a global movement where there was much more trade between countries, where goods and services could be made in many places around the world, where costs came down, but a lot of manufacturing jobs in rich countries were shifted to lower wage countries like China. Well, that's kind of over. The age of globalization has given way to a much more protective, insular world. The US and China are engaged in a high-tech economic rivalry. After the pandemic, multinational companies are bringing jobs and functions closer to home. They want to make their supply chains less complicated. Populist politicians want to promote industries inside their country's borders. Globalization has given way to a much more protected system of international trade. One system replaced another. Will we remember the 2020s as the decade in which gasoline-powered cars gave way to electric cars? We might. It's only 2023. Car makers are introducing more and more electric vehicles. Batteries are lasting longer. Charging stations are still a problem, but in Norway, Iceland, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, gas-powered vehicles are giving way to electric ones. Almost 90% of new cars sold in Norway are electric. So I think it's safe to say that gas-powered vehicles are giving way to electric vehicles, at least in Norway. Perhaps we will look back on the 2020s as the decade in which gas-powered vehicles gave way to electric vehicles. Perhaps we will recognize this decade as the one in which the system changed. Who knows? All right, that is all for today. This was Plain English lesson number 597. It seems like just yesterday we were doing number 500, and now we're almost at 600. Anyway, you can find all the lesson resources for today's episode at plainenglish.com/597. That is thanks to JR, the producer. He makes sure that that's always there for you, bright and early every Monday and Thursday morning. By the way, I keep forgetting to tell you this. One of the most requested features has been a PDF of each lesson. How can I download a PDF of the lesson? I got that question all the time, and I never made it a priority because I would never have wanted it. But a lot of you wanted it, so who am I to stand in the way of what you in the audience want? So now, each lesson, not just the new ones, by the way, I mean each and every one of our 597 lessons can be downloaded as a PDF right from the transcript page. There's a link on the right-hand side of the transcript. Find any lesson you want from our catalog of 597 stories and almost 597 expressions. And you'll see on the right-hand side a bright blue button that says Download PDF. That is my gift to you as a thank you for being a great podcast audience. Next lesson, remember, is on Monday, August 14th, 2023. See you then.